What is Loosh? We may say that this clique takes the same patterned strategy within every civilization they wander into and artificially build up, as a host vessel to thus eat from within, like a queen within a hive. They coerce the rural folk into the cities by land reforms and eclipse the rural culture via the cosmopolitan and typically decadent bourgeois culture of the capital city. This is how they corral the human livestock into the urban pen, the walking cash crop of suffering that is allowed to grow tall and fat on the nutrition of frivolity and mindless pastime. And come the time of the swift slash of the sickle to dash the life from the unsuspecting cash crop, which is usually after 250 years of the civilization or empire's life cycle, the clique then moves on to their next victim and builds up another imperial host to begin the cycle anew once more. Cycle and sickle sound uncannily similar in their pronunciation, to which I would hazard a guess and say that is not by accident. And indeed, the cycle is the rhythm of time, while caged within this illusory matrix, and the sickle is that tool wielded by the father of time, thus death, to cut the threads of each age. This is found within the Sator magic square, or Sator, Arepo, Tenet, Opera, Rotas. Arepo, the sower, or cedar, guides the wheels with skill. Now, I've already stated within a previous video that Arepo derives from a Sanskrit word which can mean nihilist, without a knowledge of good or evil. Someone that's cold, uncaring, right? An angel of the void, if you will. So therefore, Arepo is the angel of the void, is the demiurge, the Yaldabaoth, the Yahweh, Yama, all of these various forces that go by, again, a multiplicity of names. So, the angel of the void, the sower, guides the wheels of skill, or Yama, the sower, guides the wheels of skill. The force of not death, not even life, but of the continuation of both. Through this cycle, through this rotational farming of Loosh, right? And of course, that occurs within the civilizational context, but it also occurs within human life itself. The civilizational aspect of this human cattle farming, this farming of Loosh, is to accentuate or to enhance, to augment the Loosh. We will get into what Loosh means. I'm just sort of setting the stage for it right now. So that deity of figure is he who they worship. The demiurge, as we would generally call him. Therefore, to conclude, through every civilizational cycle born of the harbingers of the demiurge, can it be described as rotational farming, and what they are harvesting has been referred to as Loosh by Robert Monroe, but a more specific term would be energetic flux, chaos. That currency which existence runs upon, the current of the waveform, and the sharp edge of will, which carves form out of formlessness, or everything out of endless nothingness. They, like locusts, attack the civilization and swarm it. The pests infiltrate every facet of the field and suck dry the fruit from the surrounding soil, to build up and then tear down, only to, like a pendulum, leave a field fallow for a cycle or two, permitting it regeneration, ready for another grand harvest and a feast upon the blood and bone of the human cash crop and their suffering. This is the truth behind the esoteric mantra, Order Ab Chao. Think of Loosh as the energetic flux that maintains the incessant motion of the universe, and that motion is born of the conflict between the aspects of the source and their perpetual journey to achieve equilibrium once more. This is best summed up by the Ouroboros, or even the yin-yang symbol, to which the infinity symbol is also a synonym. And this showcases the incessant dualistic struggle that produces the synthesis of tangible existence. This, invariably, all stems from the original self-division of the prime unit of pre-Genesis, God or the source of being, into an infinite number of fractals of itself, radiating from the central point, the seedbed of nothing, which birthed everything. We can think of this prime unit of pre-Genesis as pure potential undifferentiated. It can be described in numerical terms as a one, wherein it is the only one in this void beyond the void, this beyond of the beyond, and to reproduce or express its creative will, or loosh, it had to self-divide, and in doing so, it birthed the chaos of separation within the world. Separation is the self, and it's the etymological root of that word of ours. The saviour, from the Latin salvus, can be traced back to a Proto-Indo-European root of wholeness, or to make whole, and thus the Christ or Saviour figure, the nous or mind in some schools of thought, is that which is the key to return them back to sender, back home to the source. Thus, this is the deeper metaphysical truths that underpin the mystery of Christ, and even the avatars of Vishnu within the Vedic tradition, Krishna, the eighth incarnation of Vishnu, being uncannily similar in title, parables, and even a good deal of his life events were verbatim with that of Christ's. To put it in scientific terms, it is akin to the conceptions born of string theory and depicted within the movie Mr. Nobody, whereupon his one of many deaths and lives after entering this world through the soma or the moon, drinking heartily from the lethe of forgetfulness, that which has its birth and surrounds the cave of Hypnos. Time and space contracts and reverses back to the beginning, for the beginning and the end are the same. However, upon descent into this world, this underworld of earth, the childlike spirit of innocence is processed, as described above, by two angels of oblivion. These are known as the Layla in the Talmudic and even Kabbalistic philosophy. The diametric opposite to the Lilith, or Lilitu, the angels of the air, if you will, which derives, I believe, from an etymological root in Akkadian, which does literally mean air, as in Enlil, the Lord of Air, if I recall correctly. These angels of chaos and the wasting of seed, again, the air or the wind blows away the seed, right, is not maternal and is bent on destruction, not creation. They are tasked with conception, these Layla, and the dispersal of spirits upon the fertilization of seed during earthly copulation. Notice as well that that idea of seed is a synonym for semen, or even the egg. So it's very interesting how we have similar terminology in regards to fertility and human fertility as we do with, say, agricultural fertility. So the way these adepts, these human farmers, see us, they see us as human cattle or as a cash crop, right? That's why you see terms like herd immunity or herd mentality. You see human resources, human capital. These terms constantly permeate the modern world. Of course, as well, the seed that has been in use since we can imagine the Neolithic period, or the period where agrarian societies began to develop. Again, this isn't by accident. They see us as human cash crop, as loosh, as a source of loosh, and we must be destroyed, the wheat separated from the chaff, and then Obviously, the loosh is processed, it's in a usable state at that point. Again, according to Robert Monroe. So continuing on. According to the Talmudic Midrash, Tanhuma, it is stated within the Babylonian Talmud, Nida 16b, an interpretation made by the 3rd century AD Rabbi Hanina ben Papa, quote, for Rabbi Hanina ben Papa made the following exposition, quote, the name of the angel who is in charge of conception is Night, and she takes up a drop and places it in the presence of the Holy One, blessed be He, or literally the Mashiach, the intangible Mashiach, Yahweh, the demiurge, if you will, saying, quote, Sovereign of the universe, what shall be the fate of this drop? Shall it produce a strong man, or a weak man, a wise man, or a fool, a rich man, or a poor man? Unquote. Interestingly too, as we see within the famous Buddhist depiction of Yama within the Bhavara chakra, depicting the samsara or existence, the emanation from the source or being, God, if you will. That is what existence is. Expression of self-division, of that which was ultimately perfect in and of itself. Right? We see that to the top right. A Buddha points to the moon, which is the gateway to and from this world of death, or underworld. Parallel to this point, we see that Leela derives from the Hebrew for night. Leela. Night is that point where darkness descends onto the world of man, and we slip into the embrace of a short-lived, slumberous death, whereupon we wake to greet the face of the light of life in the dawn, the sun. Of course, the night is usually where love-making between a husband and wife occurs, the union of the masculine and feminine energies into the divine synthesis. And the Zohar makes this connection too by highlighting the linguistic parallels between Leil, masculine noun, and Leila, which is a feminine noun in Hebrew, night, which is related to the process of the Exodus, it states, quote, to indicate the union which took place on that night between the masculine and feminine aspects in the divine attributes, unquote. Zohar Shemoth, section 2. I suppose it's referring to Passover there, potentially. Of note too, the Ameles Potamos, river of unmindfulness, or the Lethe, meaning oblivion, forgetfulness, or concealment, is the root of the Greek for truth. The inversion of Lethe within Aletheia, or again truth, the revelation or the ability to recall the past, Aletheia, with the A prefix, like Sanskrit, is the inversion of that which precedes it, or the negative, the negation rather, of that which precedes it. So therefore, it would be unconcealment, or unforgetfulness, or non-oblivion, the opposite of oblivion, if you will. Leela and Lethe also link to the Sanskrit Leela, which, in a theological context, means the play that the gods engage in with fire, with the fire of chaos, to thus establish order or creation. The Aletheia, or enlightenment, again this is referring to that dualistic conflict which establishes the central synthesis and even radiates out from the central synthesis, right? And that cycle creates the eternality of the equilibrium, or the search for equilibrium, if you will. The Aletheia, or enlightenment, or that point of contraction upon death, which leads us inward to the centre of the source, the seedbed of nothing, which brought the potential for everything, is known in Buddhism as the Yamantaka, or the conquering of Yama, or the conquering of death. This is the truth behind the verse of John 11, verses 25 to 26, quote, The one who believes in me the Christ or the Nous, will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Again, listen to that. Quote, the one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. This goes to this notion of faith and why faith is so important. Even if you believe yourself an atheist, you have faith, or you have the potential for it. So faith is that belief in that force which is powerful yet unseen, right? That force is not an external force. It's something that we contain within ourselves, right? Therefore, the image that is spoken of in Genesis 1:27 is not a physical image. The image of God is the spirit, right? It's that part of ourself that survives death. It's not the soul. It's not the psyche. It's not you. You, of what you are, yourself, which is conjured within your frontal lobe. That dies with you, right? All the memories, all of that doesn't continue on past death. That is something that's born of the mind. What is not born of the mind is the thought, which is really the slightest comprehensible element that we can witness of that spirit or that image of God that's imprinted within every last one of us, right? Therefore, what they mean by John 11 verses 25 to 26, the one who believes in me will live even though they die. What they mean is that if you understand that part of you that is not the self, right? It's not the point of separation. That part of you which is the Christ or the Saviour, again meaning part of you that is in unity, that is whole, that part which is from the undifferentiated source, God of course, that is the part that continues on. That is eternal life. You can have eternal life through Christ or through God, which itself is an inward process. It's an inward noumenon. A noumenon is the diametric opposite in many ways of a phenomenon. A phenomenon is something that's materially based, right? A noumenon is something that's outwardly somewhat incomprehensible, and it is metaphysical in its inherent nature, right? Continuing on, this has doctrinal corollaries within other religions too, of course. To conquer death, one must understand that his self or psyche, that separated fractal form, a poor imitation of the greater source, will one day cease to exist and will be subsumed back into the chaos of the recycling wheel. But there is an essence that is beyond the purview of death, the spirit or image of God, Genesis 1:27. The image of God in the original Hebrew is the Bra, right? Bra derives from the ancient Egyptian word Ka. You find a lot of that Hebrew peculiarly, or not so peculiarly as I will detail in other videos in the future. Hebrew contains a lot of loanwords from Kemetic. Very interesting indeed. Of course, as well, there's even a lot of records that make the connection between the Jewish nation and the ancient Egyptians, seeing them as the same people, which is, again, very interesting, something I will shed light upon in another series of videos. But the Bra links with the Ka. In the Kemetic language, the Ka is the spirit, it's the breath, like the Ruach, right, in Hebrew, not the soul. Soul is something, or the psyche is something entirely different. So is the self, which is born of the frontal lobe. The spirit is something it's the thing that's eternal. All other things are temporal. Your memories won't go with you when you die. Your self won't go with you. That's merely something that was conjured within the first 25 years of your life, based on environmental factors. That creates your persona, or literally from the Greek, the mask that your character wears. A lot of people begin to think that the mask or the persona or the ego, anything like that, is them, right? They take on a very narcissistic view of the world, of themselves as well, of course. But that is not you, right? That is merely something that facilitates your interfacing with this world, right? That we see, this world of the senses. None of that is you. That which resides within you, the image of God, again, God has no name. Yahweh isn't God, of course. God has no name. It has no form as well. It resides within the beyond of the beyond, right? So it can never have an image made to it. That's why idolatry is a sin, because it's impossible. You're attempting to subvert the natural order of things, right? You can't narrow down that which is formless into form. To do so is to firstly narrow its potential and to narrow the truth which it embodies, which really is infinite in scope. And thus, you enter into a sort of state of arrested development. You can never gain enlightenment. You can never find the truth of God. But anyway, that's what that Genesis 1:27 is referring to, the Spirit. This literally the Spirit of God. We were made in the Spirit of God. That resides within us. God is internal to us. It's not external. Stop externalizing your power to churches who, as you can see, are demonstrably corrupt, degenerate, and they have a perverse view of God, life, and a lot of them don't even have faith. If you understand faith as of that knowing of that which is unseen, yet is powerful, it's felt. You can feel it through the thought. The thought seemingly has no source within our mind. If that was not the case, then science would have sought or pursued technology to directly create thoughts within one's mind, instead of using frequency, be it external or via internal implants within the mind itself, to thus control or manipulate the processor of the thought, which is the organ of the mind. Therefore, it would seem that they realised very early on that the thought is beyond direct control. It must be controlled indirectly. It can't be conjured or created without. Believe you me though, they would love to conjure thoughts directly. They would love to have the power of this spirit, that driving force of life and sentience itself. If they had that, that would allow them to artificially create life. Not just from a synthetic womb, but to actually artificially establish a new species with a driving force, a spirit behind it that is entirely alien, but is more in keeping with the ruling class's long-term goals which surround power and the maintaining of it, to reform the world itself from the foundation point upwards, again to create the golem. But they don't have that technology. Or perhaps, as I argue, that is beyond the realms of possibility in terms of what technology can manipulate. Technology can only manipulate the physical world. It cannot manipulate, not as we've seen up to now, it cannot manipulate that which is intangible or is within the metaphysical realms. They can't really accomplish that because the thought is beyond the mind. It drives the mind, but it's beyond it. Your mind, the organ, is merely the receptor or the receptacle of that thought, of the light of God, right? Some individuals in Kabbalah call it the Ein Sof, the Ein Sof hour. Again, they have a rather distorted view of it, in my opinion, but fundamentally, that's what we're talking about here. And obviously that image of God, that Spirit of God, will continue beyond even space and time. To understand that greater and eternal part of what is not yourself, because yourself is born of an illusion of separation, and to understand that God resides within us and is the primary aspect of this vessel, which is merely convoluted by the integration of the spirit with the mind and then the body. This produces a stratification of the spirit into the temporal qualities of the psyche or the soul, the self that stems from the frontal lobe, the neurological system and its driving force of electricity, behavioural drives that are born of environmental considerations and hormonal impetus, and finally, the structure and functions of the body. This is the descent of the spirit, that which is eternal, into the temporal realm, and this is why childbirth is chaotic, has a great deal of suffering, and a flurry of emotions surface. Yamantaka, the nemesis of the force of Yama, or death, a Sanskrit name that can be broken down into two primary elements, Yama, the god of death, or literally time, and Antaka, or the destroyer. Thus, Yamantaka means destroyer of death or conqueror of death. This links to Christ, or he who conquered death, and thus the mystery of Christ is wrapped up in this conception of the attaining of the transcendence of death by the knowledge of the self and the realization of the indwelling presence of God, that which is our spirit. As the self derives etymologically from the Proto-Indo-European swe, separate or apart, we see that Saviour derives, in contrast etymologically, from the opposite, from the Latin salvos, which itself derives from the Proto-Indo-European salvos, from Proto-Indo-European solvos, from sol or whole, and vos, whence Latin vos, or the suffix of vos, comes from. For a similar semantic development, see wholesome, right? It's that idea. Hence, the Saviour or Christ is that force which will permit us to identify the unity of being as opposed to the separation of self, and thus we shall understand that God dwells within us and is the central element of truth, of which the self is the surrounding lie, obfuscating that said central element of truth. There is a great complexity to the strata of the self and the being, but the integrative process of it, where the eternal spirit was condensed into this vessel for the temporal psyche or soul, can be succinctly generalized as the eternal spirit or breath of God, the image of God, if you will, the Holy Spirit or the Ruach HaKodesh, the temporal psyche that is housed within the mind and produces the self, or the separation of the unity of the spirit, and the infernal vessel itself which houses this lower base nature. The soul or psyche enters a state of non-existence or death upon the ending of our mortal coil, and this is found in a plethora of biblical and other religious works. But we read in Ezekiel 18:4 that, quote, "Behold, all souls are mine. The soul of the Father, as well as the soul of the Son, is mine. The soul whose sins shall die," unquote. This spirit is God and endows man with his intellect, born of thought or those inklings of pure inspiration that seem to emanate from nothing, yet birth everything that we see around us. Only through reattaining the understanding of the wholeness of the Spirit, or the salvos, the salvation, can one enter that intellectual and spiritual knowledge of the Spirit and of the purpose of why we dwell here. This is the reason for Christ's remarks in John 11, verses 25 to 26, quote, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Unquote. Indeed, there is no other way of interpreting this verse, as cryptic as it is, unless you understand the greater profundity of the mystery of Christ. Ephesians 3, verses 4 to 9, quote, the mystery which for ages has been hidden in God, who created all things, unquote, or the Spirit which resides in us all and is awaiting to be unlocked by the example of Christ, or the Saviour, as this force goes by many titles. This is also the summation of the journey of enlightenment within Buddhism and the Vedic religions entirely. The Yamantaka, as mentioned, or the ending of death, where the individual knows of the deep treasure that lies within him. It was hidden from his eyes, for he could not see. It was silent to his ears, for he could not hear. And it was hollow to the touch, for his heart was callous and could not feel. This is the final awakening within the journey of individual redemption, the salvation of the flickering candle, of the spirit, from the tenebrosity of the cave of death, the sator, demiurge, who planted the seed for the salvation, or satori, meaning the awakening in Japanese. Altogether, this is the profundity of the Saviour figure, or he we know as Christ, or Krishna, again goes by a myriad of titles. We will now define what Lush is, from Robert Monroe's work, and why it is of significance when discussing this cabal and its age-old cyclical agendas of sacrificing or harvest. To begin etymologically, louche derives from the French word louche, which refers to being blind in one eye, a symbolic trope that seems to have begun within the Atenist cult, as can be seen vis-a-vis the Nefertiti bust. However, louche can be defined as a form of energy which is produced primarily from the suffering, loneliness, and pure negative emotion of sentient creatures. The louche itself is merely grown by those aforesaid methods, but the harvest of the louche, where it releases from the human crop and is translated into a usable state, is done via the expiration of the human cash crop. Now, I must preface that the louche I have just spoken of is what many would call negative louche, and in many ways, louche can be understood as being in two primary categories, that of positive louche, or first-order emotions, and negative louche, or second-order emotions. God is a zero-order being, humans are first-order, and thought forms, or egregoric entities, of which our self is one, without a direct psycho-spiritual imprint made on them by God, are second-order beings. Again, what you find with the NPC or the husk, they have literally become their egregor, right? They've literally become the shadow of their spirit, which is their self. So this shadow of the spirit, the self or the egregor, the tulpa, if you will, literally becomes them. That's the issue with narcissism. That's why narcissism is actually predatorial, because once you cling to the shadows, once you cling to the shadow of your spirit, you take on that extremely low form of being within the plane of existence. you become self-destructive, right? As we see now, within every civilization, frivolity, vanity, and a general narcissistic and nihilistic outlook, something that's one would call godless, right? Perverted or degenerate. Those become the symptoms of a dying society. Why are those the symptoms of a dying society? Because it's an inversion of everything that we see, right? Because it's an inversion of being. It's the lowest form of being, which in and of itself is almost, it's artificial, right? Of course, humans die because they're artificial as well. God is eternal because he is zero order. But second order, that which is, derives from human beings, that which derives as a shadow from the human, it's very, very temporal, very ephemeral. It doesn't last for very long. That's why godlessness, in all of its varying forms, is typically seen at the end of all civilizations. And the irony is they think themselves the most sophisticated, in comparison to their ancestors, who were largely godly or pious. Once that is inverted, and the second order of emotions becomes becomes prominent, then everything obviously destroys itself. Hence, first order emotions are those which directly stem from God and are, generally speaking, perfect. True love and long-term pair bonding, truth, awareness, knowledge, and abstention from the love of money. Second order emotions are born of corruption, of the world born from the sin of Sophia, born of the illusion she created, and charged the demiurge with maintaining lust, hatred, fear, jealousy, and contempt, that which really stems from unfulfillment. Again, people are unfulfilled because there's a void where their heart once was. You can think of the heart, symbolically as that organ that connects to God, right? Connects to the Spirit. That's why you see Christ as well with the burning heart, relighting that knowledge of the bridge between you and God, right? Between what this vessel is and God, right? That eternal part that makes up your vessel, makes up your body, your mind, all of the composite parts that make up you. It's understanding that. What the Yamadutas, the clique which follow the demiurge, or Yama, seeks to do is to trick you through coercion, mental manipulation, and force into converting that positive loosh into the negative form which sustains them. Therefore, in this sense, loosh is synonymous with emotions. If we understand emotions to be the energetic essence which provides charge to the creative will of God, then loosh, or love, is that currency of energetic flux which existence requires as a necessity for its own survival. Think of it like a standing wave. If you were to project the standing wave, firstly project it into a wave form, you would get a general sine wave, right? That line which oscillates between the mean line. However, if you were to put that into particles, project it, and you would find that energetic flux, that vacillation or oscillation of energy, produces the artificial sense of motion between the particles. That artificial sense of motion is born of the repetition of what seems to be, again projected into particles, the fricative motion of that projected waveform. The friction, or the motion, is that which existence is built upon. Without that motion, without the friction, that mean line, there can be no curving of it. There can be no constant search for equilibrium. Therefore, existence itself would be in a state of non-existence. It would go back to the source, right? That's why when you flatline, everything goes back to that straight line. It's no longer curved. Space, time is no longer curved. It is completely still. It is in a state of non-state. It exists within non-existence. Again, a sort of paradox in terms, but it's the only way to describe this force of God, right? Which, of course, in and of itself is largely incomprehensible. We can only make partial analysis of it. However, then Lush, or love, is that transparency of energetic flux which existence requires as a necessity for its own survival. To further define our terms within the confines of this discussion on Lush. Oh, by the way, that idea of Lush and love, as we see within, I believe, Robert Monroe's book, he makes that connection between Lush and love, that both of them are synonymous, right? I mean, hate itself is merely a negative form of love, right? Just as a positive Lush, within its lower form, it's still Lush. It's just merely within a transmuted state. I hope that makes sense. So hatred really is a form of love. It just is within, again, a transmuted state, because love is the higher source of hate. You first have to have love to then have hate, right? You first have to have that which is a positive charge to thus have the inversion of that positive charge, right? That idea of love being synonymous with Lush, that really ties into Aleister Crowley's, love shall be the law, love under will. Very interesting that Robert Monroe makes that connection. Again, we can substitute love for Lush, right? Lush shall be the law, Lush under will, right? So Lush, the striving for Lush, shall underpin all that we do within this world, according to the Thelemites, according to Aleister Crowley. Again, Thelema, like all of these neo-esoteric groups, is born out of this same conspiratorial fomentation. Is born out of earlier secret societies such as Masonry, the Knights Templar, all of these various societies. The Rosicrucians is another one. Of course, the Knightly Orders, all of them, including, as I've stated, the Knights Templar. They're all born out of this conspiratorial fomentation, which traces back to, you can trace it as far back as the recorded, to the Harappan civilization, or the Indus Valley civilization. You can see that within the form of Pashupati. Again, contrast that with Eliphas Levi's Baphomet. They're the same character, the same creature. Of course, that links with Cernunnos. I believe I touch upon this within these notes anyway, but that links with Cern. Again, Cernunnos. Cern means horn. That's where this derives from. The Serim of the Semites. Pan, who was a satyr within the Hellenic world. The Roman world as well, of course. So it all links, all ties together. To further define our terms within the confines of this discussion on Lush, God can be understood as thus. God is defined as the original seed of consciousness, from which all existence and individual being emerged from, an infinite supply of true emotional energy to which humans are energetically connected to and have access to. It is God, or the Supreme Being, which established the duad, or the two, or the dualism, from the fractalization of its own monadic self, a separation of the void into negative and positive spaces, and thus a separation of itself into the two poles of Lush, or emotion, that creative will. However, digressing, we see that Robert Monroe, who coined the term within his work Far Journeys, stated upon that, quote, someone somewhere, or both in millions or uncountable, requires, likes, needs, values, collects, drinks, eats, or uses as a drug, like a substance, ident, louche, right? What he means by that is as above, so below, right? We also sacrifice, not just our own body, of course, and abuse it. We sacrifice things to eat, to drink. We require these things to provide for us existence, to provide for us life force energy, right? It's similar with these forces that are beyond us, beyond our comprehension. They also exist within the planes of existence. Thus, they require nourishment, which they get from louche. Electricity, oil, oxygen, gold, wheat, water, land, old coins, uranium. This is a rare substance in somewhere. And those who possess, or literally the void, and those who possess louche find it vital for whatever it is used for. Faced with this question of supply and demand, a universal law of the void or somewhere, existence really, someone decided to produce it artificially, so to speak, rather than search for it in its natural form. Again, this underpins this soul trap. The reason that this Yaldabaoth, the begetter of the void, the demiurge, created this soul trap, right? Created this garden, right? The Garden of Eden, the golden age of Saturn, Saturn's garden, all of these various concurrent mythologies, right? Discussing a garden. Again, a garden's for grown things, and we obviously are the product, the crop, which is grown there. He decided to build a garden and grow louche. In the natural state, louche was found to originate from a series of vibrational actions in the carbon-oxygen cycle, and the residue was louche in varying degrees of purity. So again, as I stated, that idea of the energetic flux, inducing artificial cycles, if you will, of chaos and order. You see it today within the media-driven cycles of crisis, consolidation, and respite, right? And continuing on and on. So crisis, consolidation, respite, crisis, consolidation, respite, which is born from the same triad, problem, reaction, solution, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Again, this is the recycling of souls, right? So this is the wheel, or the samsara, as it's stated within the Vedic tradition. It occurred only during such action, and secondarily during the reactive process. Prospectors from somewhere ranged far and wide in search of louche sources, and new discoveries were hailed with much enthusiasm and reward. So it was that someone, or the demiurge, and his garden changed all this. Far off, in a remote area, he set to work on his experiment. And of course, I just wish to state as well, like their demiurgic god or deity that they worship, the force that they worship, this conspiratorial clique, they are also attempting to perfect this system, this garden, right? This soul trap, through the internet of all things, through AI, through now synthetically creating human beings within batteries of artificial wombs, right? The brave new world that Aldous Huxley and Julian Huxley envisioned. Julian Huxley, of course, was a founder within the UN, and he coined the term transhuman. Continuing on, first he created a proper environment for the carbon-oxygen cycle, where it would flourish. It was by accident that someone, or the demiurge, came upon the prime catalyst as regards louche production. Monstrous and slow-moving mobiles, or, if you will, pre-human, right? The sentient beings that were prior to our own creation, had a lifespan far out of proportion to their nourishment input. The growth and life termination process was of such length that soon the mobiles would all but decimate the second crop. The entire garden would be out of balance, and there would be no lush production whatsoever. Both the second and third crop faced extinction as the second crop grew scarce. Energy needs of the mobiles became acute. Often two mobiles would seek to ingest the identical second crop unit. This created conflict, which resulted in physical struggle among two or more of the ungainly mobiles. Someone observed these struggles, at first bemused with the problem, then with great interest. As the struggles ensued, the war, the chaos, the mobiles were emanating lush, not in fractional amounts, but in sizable, usable quantities, and of a much higher purity. He quickly put the theory to the test. He removed another unit of first crop from the liquid garden area, redesigned it for the gaseous environment, but with one significant change. The new mobile, or the new human, would be somewhat smaller, but would require the ingestion of other mobiles for nourishment. In fact, rather, mobiles are those sentient creatures, so even animals as well would be considered mobiles, right? This would solve the problem of overpopulation of the mobiles, and at the same time would create good quantities of usable lush during each conflict and struggle phase, plus a bonus if the new class of mobiles terminated the lifespan of the other, right? So lush is emanated, it's radiated, transmitted to this someone, as Robert Monroe states, the demiurge, upon the death of the mobile or the human or even the animal, right? And as they state there, using food would solve the problem of overpopulation of the mobile stock, right? That is, they use famine constantly to destroy us, to terminate our life. Again, this is seen within the Four Horsemen concept too. That idea of pestilence, war and famine leading to death or the release of lush, right? Conflict among carbon-oxygen cycle units brings forth consistent emanations of lush. It was as simple. This is why you have the Yamajutas, if you will, the conspiratorial clique creating, fomenting crisis after crisis after crisis, creating these cyclical, or oscillating patterns of conflict, right? It's to create lush, it's to create unfulfillment, suffering, general chaos. That's why they state order ab chaos, right? Order out of chaos, or creation from lush, or the continuation of themselves from lush. It was as simple. The chemical residue from these ingestive actions settled to the bottom of the liquid medium and so provided new nourishment for the stationaries, modified second crop, completing the circuit. Again, we don't have to understand all of that. I've sort of went through it all. He's merely discussing the experiments within his terms that the someone or the demiurge did to, again, create us. The result was a steady flow of lush from the lifespan termination of the stationaries, from the intense conflict among the mobiles to avoid ingestion, and finally from the sudden termination of the lifespans of such mobiles as the inevitable product of such conflict. To handle the output, someone set up special collectors to aid in the harvest. He set up channels to convey the raw lush from his garden to somewhere, literally from earth, the garden, to the void, right, to his abode. No longer did somewhere depend principally upon the wild state of lush. No longer did somewhere depend principally upon the wild state is the principal source of loosh. The garden of someone had ended that. With the success of the garden and the production of loosh by cultivated means, others began to design and build their own gardens. This was in accordance with the law of supply and demand. Vacuum is an unsustainable condition, as the amounts of loosh from someone's garden only partially met the requirements of somewhere. Collectors on behalf of the others actually entered the garden of someone to take advantage of those small emanations of loosh overlooked or ignored by the collectors of someone. The collectors are the Yamadutas. The collectors is, in essence, the conspiracy that underpins this all, that clique, that cabal. A secondary purpose was to provide occasional extra amounts of loosh created by such harvesting. To reap such harvest, the collectors generated storms of turbulence and turmoil. There you go. To reap such harvest, the collectors generated, artificially of course, storms of turbulence and turmoil in both the gaseous envelope and the more solid chemical formations that were the base of the garden itself. By that, what they mean is they created these artificial civilizations, then got them up to such a point, then tore them down. Such upheavals had the effect of terminating lifespans of multitudes of the fourth crop, or us, as they were crushed under the rolling base formation or smothered under waves from the agitated liquid area of the garden. This is this idea of the Great Deluge, right? The catastrophe, that's what it's talking about. The pre-catastrophe civilization succumbed potentially to an actual physical deluge or to a metaphorical deluge, right? It was smothered by death, by the haunt of death, right? By the collectors inducing it. Those same collectors are still inducing that deluge of death as we see it now. The fourth horseman, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, essentially. As we see here, this explains the reasoning behind this cult, of whom worship the demiurge or revere him, and their incessant need to sow the seeds of imperial conquest and the subsequent decline and destruction of the said imperium. These are the sub-gardens of loosh production, the urban environment, and the artificial enclosure for the human cash crop to thence roam freely within until the time of the cull, where the loosh shall be outputted from the act of their death. This cult, as we see above, are the terrestrial collectors that facilitate these mass harvests of loosh when required for the sustaining of the heavenly emanations of existence, or to maintain existence itself via energetic flux. To the theologians among us, they will be able to understand such imagery as it appears deeply within the Old and New Testament. For example, a list of verses pertaining to this mass loosh harvest, not including the history, which shows this clique behind such mass devastations and artificial collapses and die-offs, for lack of a better frame of description. Matthew chapter 9, verse 37 to 38, quote, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field," unquote. Joel 3:13, quote, "Swing the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, trample the grapes, for the winepress is full, and the vats overflow, so great is their wickedness," unquote. Exodus 22, verse 29, quote, "Do not hold back offerings from your granaries or your vats," quote, "You must give me the firstborn of your sons," unquote. Isaiah 17, verse 11, quote, "Though in the day you set them out, you make them grow, and on the morning, when you plant them, you bring them to bud. Yet the harvest will be as nothing in the day of disease and incurable pain." Unquote. Leviticus 23 verse 10, quote, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you, and you reap its harvest, bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest." Unquote. Revelation 14 verses 14 to 16, quote, "Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and on the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, quote, 'Thrust in your sickle and reap, for the time has come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe.' So he who sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped." Unquote. Revelation 14 verses 18 to 20, quote, "And another angel came out from the altar, who had power over fire, and he cried with a loud cry to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, 'Thrust in your sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe.' So the angel thrust his sickle into the earth, and gathered the vine of the earth, and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trampled outside the city, and blood came out of the winepress up to the horses' bridles for 1,600 stadia." Unquote. As we see too, the Garden of Eden, or Gan Eden, etymologically yields the true translation of enclosure of the human fruit or crop. Gan within the Greek Septuagint is, along with pardesand, is translated as paradisos. Now, of note too, before we go into the etymology of paradise, we see that the term Gan also is the potential etymological root of the Greek genea, or generation, descent, and hikonomea, I come into being, which is interesting given the current technocratic babble regarding genetic hacking. However, on the etymology of paradise, the word paradise entered English from the French paradis, which was inherited from the Latin paradisos, from the Greek paradisos. The Greek, in turn, was derived from an old Iranian form itself, from the Proto-Iranian paradeia, meaning walled enclosure. The old Iranian word had been borrowed into the Akkadian language as paradesu, or domain. It subsequently came to indicate the expansive, walled gardens of the First Persian Empire, and was subsequently borrowed into a number of languages. Into Greek as paradisos, as I've mentioned, meaning a park for animals. That was included in the Anabasis, the most famous work of the early 4th century BCE by the Athenian Xenophon or Xenophon, into Aramaic as paradesa, meaning a royal park, and into Hebrew as parades, meaning an orchard. Park for animals is compelling, given that the louche concept and its definition is purported by Robert Monroe above. As a tangential point, we even see the proto-Shiva deity from Mohenjo-Daro, part of the Harappan or Indus Valley civilization, was very similar to the later depiction of the Eliphas Levi Baphomet and even the Celtic Cernunnos, or the Horned One, where Cern or Cairn in Switzerland derives its name from, the horn, or, if viewed internally from top to bottom, a funnel and spiral like that of the swastika, the spiritual exit and centre, and the satyrs or pan-like serim of the Semites. Pashupati, being probably as old as the 4th millennium BC, is the beginning of this cult and is and it is the force they worship, Pashupati, literally meaning Lord of all animals. Hence the relation to the park for animals. And evidently, we are the animals to them, the human cattle. Digressing, however, as is evident, the Gan of Gan Eden was visualized by the Greek compilers of the Septuagint as a walled enclosure. Now on to Eden, and this one is far more straightforward to etymologically pinpoint. Quote, the name derives from the Akkadian Edinu, from a Sumerian word Edin, meaning plain or steppe, closely related to an Aramaic root word meaning fruitful, well watered. I wish to state as well, the old Gaelic term, or name rather, for Edinburgh was Dunedin, or the hill fort of Eden, right? Of course, we have Edinburgh, which is, a borough is a type of town, I believe, within Anglo-Saxon. It's a type of town or city, a chartered city or town. So, the town of Eden. So quite interesting. Eden, or Eden, is a Gaelic word that means the fiery one, or the little fire. Even just fire on its own. So, of course, Dunedin would be the hill fort of fire. Quite interesting. Of course, fire is quite an esoterically significant symbol. Of course, elementally, and in the general metaphysics of enlightenment or salvation. So it's quite interesting indeed. Stepping away from the link between the Bel or Marduk deity and his connection to the steppes, along with his Amorite host, from a Sumerian word Eden, meaning plain or steppe, closely related to an Aramaic root word, meaning fruitful or well-watered. Stepping away from the link between the Bel or Marduk deity and this connection to the steppes, along with his Amorite host, we can nevertheless see here that the Aramaic or Highland Amorite word that corresponds to Eden means something that is fruitful or well-watered. Indeed, as we had just read above regarding Lush, the vessels of sacrifice or physical human bodies are well-watered via the instinctual drive of survival and the seeking out of sustenance via the taking of other sentient life in a bid to extend their own. Moreover, the human cash crop could also be likened to a fruit that is maintained in an orchard or enclosure, be that urban in style and location, or simply an enclosure encompassed by nature herself, as we see within Fight Club. In the scene depicting the explosion of the narrator's apartment, we see that the slogan to the apartment complex is, quote, a place to be somebody, unquote. Of course, this is symbolically satirical and is utilised to highlight the irony that these places that the corporate drone buys to experience modern luxury in fact become postmodern prisons. As Durden states, quote, the things you own end up owning you, unquote. Indeed, we must make note of the fact that, quote, a place to be somebody, unquote, implying a corpse or a body, is that of a cemetery, where the dead dwell in rows and Hades beckons them to spring forth from their timber crypts and draw near to the land of deathly slumber and howling unfulfillment. The skyscraper, likewise, is the symbol of earth. The pillar, attached to the pillar by the single thread of the soul, is the individual without individuation. The drone who slaves for the queen without knowing truly why. But it is upon the pillar that the lowest can connect with the highest, where our base essence can begin us on the journey to rediscover our true self and conquer the currency of the illusion, fear. This indeed is what we see within the overarching story of Durden and the narrator, the demiurge and the human who seeks gnosis. Ultimately, the human realizes, through the process of gnosis, that both the demiurge and himself are the same being, that the demiurge is the creator who was created, and so are we. To rein in this wild and bestial part of our nature, the self-trickster who deceives the senses and perpetuates the lie, is the most important struggle we will ever face within our lives, and is, in truth, at the heart of all of the struggles we will bear within our lives. It lies at the heart of all of the conflicts of the world. Assuredly, without knowing of this deep-seated truth as a matter of experience, then one will be susceptible to the mental and spiritual volatility born of unfulfillment. Unfulfillment is one of the major contributors to the production of negative loosh, of course. Quote, "There it was, an experimental, modified fourth crop unit." This is from Robert Monroe's book, Far Journeys. One of those that contained a piece of himself in its functional pattern. It was standing alone under the leafy upper portion of a large second crop unit. It was not hungry. It was not in conflict with another fourth crop unit. It was not acting in defence of its young. Then why did it emanate distilled loosh in such great quantity? Someone moved closer. His perception entered the modified fourth crop unit, and then he knew. The unit was lonely. It was this effect that produced distilled loosh. The balance of the story is well known. Someone included the fundamental in his formula. The creation of pure distilled loosh is brought forth in type 4M units, humans, by the action of unfulfillment, but only if such pattern is enacted at a vibratory level above the sensory bounds of the environment. The greater the intensity of said pattern, the greater the output of loosh distillate. To put the formula into effect, someone designed subtle changes in his garden, all of them familiar to every historian. The splitting of all crop units into halves, to engender loneliness as they sought to reunite, and the encouragement of dominance of the type 4M unit, humans, are but two of the most noteworthy innovations. As it appears now, the garden is a fascinating spectacle of efficiency. The collectors have long since become masters of the art of the DLP formula, distilled loosh production. Type 4M, the collectors are the cabal that rule the world at present. Type 4M units dominate and have spread through the entire garden, with the exception of the deeper portions of the liquid medium. These are the principal producers of loosh distillate. From experience, the collectors have evolved an entire technology of complementary tools for the harvesting of loosh from the type 4M units, humans. The most common have been named love, friendship, family, greed, hate, pain, guilt, disease, pride, ambition, ownership, possession, sacrifice, abortion, and on a larger scale, nations, provincialism, wars, famine, religion, machines, freedom, industry, trade, to list a few. Loosh production is higher than ever before, unquote. This refers to the Adam Kadmon, or primordial man, and the Garden of Eden, to which, as I have previously mentioned, we can now see the reason for it and the reason the demiurge created it. However, that said, notice that loneliness produces distilled loosh, or energetic flux, through innate vibratory emotions reacting to it. This may also explain the source of being's need to then self-divide into greater and greater amounts of fractals, which allows it to maintain its sanity or psychospiritual stability through each individual fractal reacting to the other. This refers to that which is described as the perfect state, the void before the void, non-existence in its ultimate state of non-state. It is peace via static. It is tranquility through deafening calm. And as Agent Smith states, as I will include the quote below, the human mind cannot fathom or stand it. We only have to look at those who undergo long periods of total isolation, asylum inmates and prisoners, to understand that for the majority, the mind will fracture and destroy itself if it is catapulted into a state resembling that pre-Genesis state. This is the paradox of being, that it incessantly must self-divide and maintain reactivity with other figments or fractals of itself to thence maintain its own sanity. Nothing is as it seems. Perfection is arguably an imperfect state. The quote of Agent Smith, which also refers to the paradisical or enclosed and self-contained human farm that is civilization. Quote, "Did you know that the first Matrix was designed to be a perfect human world, where none suffered, where everyone would be happy? It was a disaster. No one would accept the program. Entire crops were lost. Some believed we lacked the programming language to describe your perfect world. But I believe that, as a species, human beings define their reality through suffering and misery. The perfect world was a dream that your primitive cerebrum kept trying to wake up from, which is why the Matrix was redesigned to this, the peak of your civilization. I say your civilization because as soon as we started thinking for you, it really became our civilization, which is, of course, what this is all about. Evolution, Morpheus. Evolution." Unquote. Agent Smith. This place is the garden, and human suffering is the cash crop. That is the truth of the Garden of Eden story, and is the reason the capricious creator, whom was created himself, established it. Digressing back to our discussion on the Robert Monroe quote, we see that loneliness and unfulfillment are two of the primary means in which negative loosh is produced, and of course, as we see within the postmodern dystopia, we are flinging ourselves physically and psychospiritually into, or the vast majority at least, is one which the urban environment produces, not just atomization, but hyper-atomization. Women and men have been hoodwinked into leading a lifestyle that they are repeatedly told is fashionable, thus socially validating, normal, if you will, which will fundamentally lead them to a life of loneliness, misery, a lack of meaningful relationships, and an utter evisceration of any potential for happiness. This is done via dating apps, social media, advertisement, and the online digital framework which produces unattainable expectations, a lack of upward mobility, and an easy slide into isolative activity. The consumerist nightmare that is slowly leading to an unbridled despotism within the post-consumerist age. All of this ensures fulfillment can never be achieved within life, and that we become islands within a vast ocean of nothingness. A vacuum of meaning rides upon the endless waves of fashion, and we, compliant consumers, await the great tsunami to submerge the island, our one bastion of security, is then shown to be, like everything else, a lie. This is the great game that has been played on us, and additionally, it is how the collectors, the Yamadutas, or Yamajudas, or messengers of the Lord, usher us onto the plantation and crack forth the whip upon our collective spiritual backs. Irrespective of colour, creed, or countenance, they demand their pound of flesh and seek to make flow rivers of blood as high as the hill. The rotational farming created by this clique, these collectors, who use inflation and taxation of finance and life force energy to engender a complex of suffering, a machine of mayhem powers this chaos engine.
Hey everybody, I wanted to explain to you what crop rotation means and how it's applied to your life. I think I have a very unique position as being a farmer and an entertainer, so I can apply a lot of farming truth to what is being done to people. Okay, you see how in this field all the grass is short because I have my animals over here, and then you see the line, and now this field the grass is growing, and then I have another field over there that I allow the grass to grow longer. So basically what crop rotation is the animals eat this down, but not too low so that it kills the grass. As soon as the grass gets eaten down, you move them to the new field. That allows this field to grow. All of that manure becomes beautiful soil. This is a regenerative process. This is why animals are very important for making soil. They're an incredible part of the ecology. And so that's all short like a putting green. This is starting to get longer. Right now I'm putting the fencing around the trees to get the animals ready to come in. Okay, so how are the farmers of man rotating your crop? So what happens is, what is our product? Those guys, the product is milk. Those guys, the product is wool. Humans, it's consciousness and it's attention, it's eyeballs. That's what we're farmed for. So I believe that they do crop rotation and field rotation just like I do it to these animals. So you get everyone's attention. It's all based on trauma. War, war, war. Pestilence, pestilence, pestilence. You know, buy, 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 buy. Rotate, rotate, rotate. You see how they do it? And the they isn't some mysterious group. It's just farmers of man. And so think about that. Think about how you're being farmed. So, well, you had one field that was like this, and it got down to there. As soon as the grass got eaten down, the trauma was sucked up, the businesses were consolidated. They then shifted to the next field. They let that field grow back, right? It's really fascinating when you see it. And then they milk you on the next field. So, I don't know if anybody has any, I know that Twitter is like an Amish classroom, so there's going to be a huge amount of people that aren't aware enough to even understand what I'm saying, and they'll call me schizophrenic, crazy, smooth brain, don't procreate, all that stuff. But I know there's some of you guys that are starting to understand this. When I showed you that video about milking goats and how you put them in debt, you give them the grain, you keep them divided, and you take their milk, and then you castrate the males you don't want procreating, and you say they're brave and beautiful. That really resonated with a lot of people. So I'm really trying to show you guys more and more metaphor of like what we're farmed for and what animals are farmed for, and how me as an entertainer and a farmer can see how it all works together. You see, right now they're allowed in that pen, and that's why people like me have always been censored, because I don't follow the rules of the pen or the gates. A gatekeeper, like a Joe Rogan, Steven Crowder, Anderson Cooper, Tucker Carlson, I don't even know who's in left-wing media, but like the New York Times, the Washington Gazette, whatever the hell these things are, these are the gates. You see how there's a gate? And the gate says, this is how far you can go. And then they keep you in that pasture where you eat that, your consciousness is farmed, the gate opens, and then things shift. Oh, now you can talk about that, but you can't talk about this. Oh, now you can talk about what really happened in Afghanistan, but not about Ukraine, right? The gate, 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 and then farm, 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 farm. Move the pasture, suck up the resources, and the human milk is loosh. It's attention, it's emotion, it's consciousness. And I just thought you guys, there's a good amount of you guys that find this stuff interesting. That's why people like Joe Rogan are called gatekeepers. They bring on people like me and say, oh, too far. You're not allowed in that field yet. And you know what I say to them? Bitch, I'm not a cow. All right, much love, everybody.